I'll show you can grab a vertex and snap it to various different points on the grid. And then you have various different degrees of snapping, 2, 2.5, and 3. Default is 3. I usually leave it on 3. And then you have rotation snaps. And I use rotation snaps quite often because if you turn rotation snaps on, it will snap in increments of 5 degrees, which means that you can very easily rotate an object to 90 or 45 degrees. And you'll be able to see that by watching the yellow numbers change in the center of the screen there. So you can see right now I've rotated it 180 degrees, and it snaps by 5 degree increments. Whereas if I were to turn that off, it would free rotate, and that snaps by 1/100ths of a degree increments, which is very precise if you need to rotate something precisely. But it's not very quick if you need to line something up exactly to a certain degree, like a 45 or a 90. So once again, snap's very useful. I'm going to skip the rest of these here, and the only ones I'm going to show you after that are the material editor. The material editor is almost like its own application in 3D Studio Max. It's very deep and complicated, and if I do a tutorial later on introductions to unwrapping and materials in Max, I'll get into it in more detail. But you can find it up here in the main toolbar with this little checkered sphere. And at this point in time, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you how to apply a material. So at the beginning, all materials are just named default 1, default 2, default 3. And it's just a gray blend material. So this little arrow here is how you assign it to an object. So you can either assign it by clicking on this arrow and having an object selected, and that will assign to the object, and Control Z to undo, by the way. Or you can drag it over to your selection by just grabbing the material and dropping it on top of your selection, which is also very easy. And then if you have any sort of other material maps applied down here, then you will need to enable them in the viewport as well, which right here, this little button with the checker and the light bulb, is how you can turn it on and off in the viewport. But we don't have any of those applied right now, so you will not see the effect of that. But I'm just going to drag my gray standard blend material over to this box. And that's the material editor in short. So why don't we get started looking at some actual modeling stuff now? I think we've spent enough time looking at various different manipulation tools and navigation tools. Let's get right into the meat of the modeling. So to create objects, polygonal objects in 3D Studio Max, there are many different ways, but the most common way is just by creating a standard primitive object and then converting it to an editable polygonal object or edit poly object, which will give you or open up a vast array of different functions. So to do that, you need to go up here to your Creation tab, which is part of your command panel. It's this little spark here. And then you need to choose Geometry, which is the first one, and it just looks like an icon of a sphere. And then underneath this, you have a bunch of different types of objects: standard primitives, extended primitives, compound objects, particle systems, and so on and so forth. But for polygonal modeling, the one that I use mostly is standard primitives. So I'll just be looking at that. Under standard primitives, to create an object, you just click the object. I'm going to use a basic box. And then you just click anywhere in your viewport, hold down with the left click, and drag it out to get one dimension, or rather 2 dimensions, and then let go of the left click and drag it vertically to get the 3rd dimension. And that's how you get your box. Now, you'll notice that underneath this box, when we first create it, there's a bunch of options here. So we can change these options. If we want to make the box an exact specific size, we can go under parameters here, and I can say I want the box to be 5. Actually, that's kind of huge. 5 meters. Why don't we go with 1.5 meters by 1.5. You can just enter in a value and then hit enter. 1.5 enter. Something else that you can do, and before I continue on, I'm just going to zero this out as I showed you before by right-clicking on the Select and Move tool, and then right-clicking on, sorry, I need to change this back to View, and I need to change the Scale tool back to Select Uniform Scale. And then what that's going to do is that's going to allow me to zero, pardon me, still on the Scale tool there, on my Select and Move. And that's going to allow me to zero out the box in world space once again, so it's centered in world space. So now that I've deselected my box, you'll notice that all of my options that were there before are gone. That will bring me to my next point, which is the Modify tab, which is the next one over from the Create tab. So once you've created something in 3D Studio Max, and you deselect away from it, you will lose its properties. So to get them back, or to modify them, you have to go over to the Modify tab, which is just to the right of the Create tab. So when we click on that, excuse me, you'll notice that, pardon me, I got a scratch in my throat there. You'll notice that there are many different properties that we can modify here. We have the name, which I'll call, for now, test object. Sorry, I selected away from it. And it's always good to name your objects, because when you get a scene with tons of different objects, or if someone else needs to open it up while you're away or something in a production environment, it's nice for them to be able to, say, okay, this is big box number 1 or small box. And the more specific they get, then the more specifically you should try to name them, rather than having them open up a scene and having box number 10,002 or something like that. So anyways, as you can see, I'm in my Modifier tab now, and my properties are back. So I always by default leave this Generate Mapping Coordinates on, and Real World Map Scale off. Those are the defaults. I don't ever really change those. Once again, I showed you that you can change the values of the length, width, and height by either moving the slider interactively or entering in a value. The other thing that you can do is you can add segments. You can add length segments, or you can add width segments, or height segments, or both. I usually tend not to add any of those. And once again, right-clicking on any of these little arrow sliders will bring them back to their zeroed out. In this case, it's not 0, it's 1, 1. So I tend not to add any segments at this stage when I'm creating an object, and it's still a standard primitive. I usually add all that stuff later on when I convert it to an editable poly. So before I go and do that, though, I'm just going to show you a few of these other standard primitives. So we have our box. We have our sphere, which is your basic sphere. And once again, you can change its radius. You can change the number of segments, so you can make it a very, very basic primitive sphere, or you can bump it right up. And if we go into shaded view, you can't tell it's a polygonal object at all because it's so smooth. So that's the sphere. And then you can actually even change the hemisphere here. So rather than having a whole sphere, you can just create half of a sphere or just a segment of a sphere. But once again, I don't tend to use that very often unless there's a very specific application for that. You can also decide if you don't want it to be smooth, but I rarely do that. I usually turn smoothing on. And you can choose to squash it if you like. But I tend not to use that very often. I mostly just edit the radius and the segments when I'm dealing with spheres. I'll just delete that one and move on to the next. We have a cylinder. Cylinder, very useful. I usually get rid of the height segments, and I tend to for game models, tend to not go lower than 8 unless it's a very small object which you won't get up too close or you won't really notice the silhouette. I tend to try to stick somewhere between 8 and 18. Sometimes it calls for higher, like around 24 or even up into the 30s, but that's rare. I like to try to stick between 8 and 18, and mostly between 8 and 12. So that's a cylinder. Once again, you can add your height segments, or you can add cap segments. I tend not to use those at all. And then we have a bunch of other stuff here, which I tend not to really use. Mostly the three primitives I use are box, sphere, and cylinder. You can play around with the others in your own time. I'm not going to show them too much in this tutorial, as they're self-explanatory, and it might be fun for you to mess around with them yourself. Likewise, if you go up here where standard primitives is, you can try messing around with the extended primitives as well. After that, I wouldn't really try too much. Compound objects, particle systems, and those kind of things will need a little bit of explanation. So just stick to standard and extended primitives and have a little bit of fun messing around with those.